I would like to say good evening to you all. In this presentation, Edgar and I will show to you how to conduct narrative inquiry, both as a science and an art. Narrative inquiry is a science because it follows a rigorous and systematic process. It is also an art because it calls for creativity on the part of the researchers and the participants. I would like to show to you the overview of our presentation this evening. For our presentation, you will see here that we are going to explain what narrative inquiry is, when to use it, what are its historical background and philosophical roots, what are the narrative inquiry approaches, what are the distinctive features of narrative inquiry, and what data collection methods can be used. And we will give you a sample of one data analysis framework that Edgar and I have used in our narrative studies. And lastly, we will talk about the ethical issues to be considered, especially those that are unique in narrative inquiry. And Edgar will start the discussion on the definition of narrative inquiry.
Thank you, Dr. Rosario, and I'm glad to greet all of you. Thank you for joining us in this webinar. Maybe we can start from this definition about narrative inquiry. We are taking the definition from Clandinin. She's from Canada, and she was a great researcher in this research design. And she says that narrative inquiry is the study of human experience. And you may say, yes, the study of human experience is actually the concern of all qualitative research designs. But particularly in narrative inquiry, we are based this study of human experience through narrative materials. So the raw material that we're using are narratives. And these narratives emerge in a social, historical context and in a process of interaction with our participants. So this is the unique feature that differentiates narrative inquiry. But we need to understand that this narrative can be also found in fictional literature, biographies, autobiographies, in oral tradition, and interviews. We are going to focus especially today in interviews in the construction of these narratives. So even though Dr. Rosario and I, we really love narrative inquiry, is not able to answer all the questions that we have to research. So we need to find the fit between our study and the perfect research design. And you can use narrative inquiry, especially when your intention is to understand human experience from a holistic approach. Let me explain this idea of holistic approach. When people tell their stories, they really tell about their entire life. They tell about their emotional experiences, spiritual experiences, in the family, in their work-related sphere. So this holistic approach to the whole person. And the idea of time. Stories follow a plot of time. Stories are actually in constant construction. They are in an ongoing process. So this idea of time going through the narratives is important to understand, that we're going to understand a process in these narratives. So in these circumstances, narrative inquiry is the best tool. So maybe a short historical background to understand narrative inquiry. Since the beginning of humanity, we are telling stories. Let me quote Riesman. He says, narrative inquiry is actually, the narration is a human impulse. We really try to tell stories all the time, especially when we try to tell something that is really important for us. We're going to use a story. The main religions in their books, they are based basically in stories. And narrations around the world are actually the most effective knowledge management medium that we have as a humanity. But in the beginning of the postmodern era, we'll find a rediscovering of narratives, because in the modern era, if you remember, the objectivity of the modern era was trying to erase stories from the language of science. But in the postmodern era, stories regain again an important presence as a medium to really get scientific knowledge. And if you go to research a little about narrative inquiry, you will find that in the last 20 years, there was like an explosion in narrative inquiry all around the world. So this is a main focus now in research.
I would like to add, Edgar.
Yes.
I'm just inspired, you know, early this afternoon, I was reading an article by Robert Atkinson, 2007. There's a line here, he says, "We think in story form, speak in story form, and bring meaning to our lives through story." So
yes,
I'm just affirming.
Yes.
I'm just
and
affirming what you said. Yeah,
when we are able to give a meaning to our lives and the lives of other people through story, that means that narratives are a powerful tool for research in human experience. Now, each research design is based in a philosophical underpinning. There is a philosophical root behind. We need to choose one. There are many philosophical ideas that we can take or choose to conduct research. But in narrative inquiry, there are especially two main channels of philosophical thought. The first one is social constructivism, which is quite common in qualitative research. The idea in social constructivism is that reality is not out there, but is the result of our interpretation. But pragmatism, as Dewey introduced, is, according to Clandinin, the best approach to narrative inquiry. Here we have some ideas as a result of taking pragmatism as the philosophical root. According to pragmatism, there is a reality out there. We need to interact with this reality. Actually, this reality is not going to change according to our interpretations. We will have interpretations about reality, but the reality is not going to change due to our interpretations. Even though we have our own understanding of reality, we also understand, according to our worldview, that there is a meta-narrative. This is like a big umbrella. There is a big story in the universe able to explain what is going on. Even what is going on with suffering and death and illness around the world. There is a meta-narrative able to explain that. But there are also micro-narratives, and we are part of these small stories. And our stories are part of the big meta-narrative in the universe. So if we share our stories, if we hear stories, we are actually going back to these micro-narratives that are constructing in a constant process the big story. But we cannot fully understand reality because it's so complex. So Dewey said, we can understand better reality if we interact in a process of transaction with reality, if we mingle with our participants, if we interact with them in their context, we will be able to really understand better, to grasp better the meaning of their experiences. So as people tell their stories, they change. As we hear the story, we also change. So this is a transactional process, and this is the idea of pragmatism. There are three main narrative inquiry approaches. I will go fast with this. We can maybe clarify better if you have more questions later. There is a critical or libertarian approach. The idea behind this is that the world and the society is not fair. So there is oppression out there. And there is some people that need to be empowered. And when they are able to tell their stories, we empower them and we give them the opportunity to grow and to go out of this situation of oppression. There is a psychological approach. In psychology, we are using narratives from the beginning of this science. Even though before a narrative inquiry was a research design, psychology was using stories to understand the process of human development and the process of transition in our phases in life. And the pragmatic-relational approach. This is the approach that we're going to explain now. So if we move to the next slide, there are some distinctive features that Dr. Rosario is going to explain to us to distinguish narrative inquiry.
Yes, so one of the questions that we as researchers ask is, how do I know that this study that I'm going to do or this article that I'm reading, this is narrative inquiry? There are distinctive features that set narrative inquiry apart from other research designs. There are several, but in this presentation, we will present only 4. And these are a personal life story, restorying, narrative portrait, and poetic portrait. We would like to emphasize that the first 3 are like musts. They must be there. And the 4th one, poetic portrait, can be optional, a decision that will be made by the researchers. So let me start with a personal life story. So you have there the word story and then life, meaning this is a story of one's life. And since you have there the word personal, it means that the one telling the story is the one who has experienced the story. Now, we want to emphasize here that in narrative inquiry, the researchers may take the whole lifespan, meaning from the participant's birth until the present, or the researchers may take only a portion of that life. For example, in the study that Evelyn, Obo, and I conducted, we studied the lives of graduate mothers. These were women who were raising small children and at the same time pursuing their PhDs. In that case, we focused the life story in that portion of time that was from the time they started their graduate studies until the time that they finished. So that's what we mean by personal life story. The next feature is restorying. You have the root word here is story, which means that the participants tell us their story. Now, why is that restory? It is restory because as researchers, we retell the story, we reconstruct the story. And you know, when we interview our participants, when they share to us their life stories, they share with us in, I would like to say, it can be iterative. It can be like they do not necessarily begin from the very beginning. They can tell us maybe about their adolescence, then they go back to their childhood, then they shift to adult life. So the telling of the story of our participants is not chronological. So the question is, who then organizes the story in the chronological frame? It's us, the researchers. We reconstruct the story or the narratives and follow the chronological frame in the process of restorying. Now, the next distinctive feature is narrative portrait. In the narrative portrait, we take the story and tell in narrative form. The poetic portrait, which in our experience and also in our reading of literature, not all narrative studies produce narrative portrait. Some do, and this is the poetic form of the narrative, okay? So these are the distinctive features. You will know the study is a narrative inquiry, especially if you see the first three features. Okay, so now we go to data collection methods. There are different or several data collection methods. The foremost or the primary data collection method is the in-depth interview. I would like to ask Edgar, how many times will we do the in-depth interview?
In-depth interview, yes, requires many encounters with our participants. Usually, at least we're talking about 3 interviews. And when we are talking about interviews in narrative inquiry, usually these interviews takes longer than other kind of interviews, because people start to narrate their stories. And when we really gain the required rapport with the people and the trust that they need to tell their stories, they really go by themselves. We don't need to ask questions to them. They're going to tell stories that really go long. So we're talking about several interviews, and these are in-depth because they are long interviews in which they are really opening their hearts and telling the story.
I would like to ask Edgar how, okay, you say this can be a series of like 3 interviews. How long should be the gaps between the interviews?
Oh, thank you for this question. This is an interesting point that I didn't see much discussion about this in the literature, but this is an important point that I have experienced. It's important to let some time between the interviews for the people to organize their ideas and to rethink their narratives. When people start with the first interview, they just try to tell, as Dr. Rosario said, sometimes out of order, they try to tell the story. But if you let 1 week between, as a frame between the first and the second interview and the third and fourth interview, people will have time to understand better their story. They're going to regain a new understanding, reframing, and regain memories about their past. So if you let some time, at least some days between interviews, people will start the next interview saying, you know, I was thinking after our last interview, and they gain new memories about their life. So it's important to let people to have some days in between the interviews.
Thank you. Another data collection method here, which we would say supportive of the in-depth interview, meaning the data that we get from the in-depth interview is being enriched or triangulated through observation. But here, this is not common observation. For other qualitative research designs, we simply say observation. But you will note here that we say observation through shadowing. Now, Edgar will tell us what shadowing is.
Well, we are acting like a shadow of our participants. So wherever they go, we go with them. Let me explain this in an example. In my last study using narrative inquiry, I was studying teachers. So the idea was to follow them. Of course, first we agree with them when, with particular schedule of their time. But from the very moment that they reached the school, I was standing on the door of the school waiting for them. And from that very moment till the end of the academic day, I was shadowing them, following them all around the school, participating with them during the entire academic day. So this is shadowing, this is living with them, along with them.
That can be quite intrusive. That's why I think we want to underscore that the process of shadowing should be understood by the participants. When you get the informed consent, you explain what is going to happen, because the participant can have a choice like, okay, you can shadow me only from this period to this period. But otherwise,
Yes.
ideally, it will be, you will be able to gather rich data if, like in the experience of Edgar, he was able to shadow his participants from the beginning of the day until the end of the day, because his study demands to have that kind of data. All right, the next one here is aesthetic portrayals. The first time I saw aesthetic portrayals as a form of data collection method was in the works of Sarah Lawrence-Lightfoot. I became very interested in this one, and I am glad that Edgar was also, and he also used this in his study. Edgar, tell us about these aesthetic portrayals.
Yes, if you remember, the title of this webinar is The Art and Science of Narrative Inquiry. And this is when the art starts to work really strong in narrative inquiry. Aesthetic portrayals is a strong, a really good source of data. We ask the participants to create kind of an artistic expression. They can choose. They need to feel confident and comfortable with the art, the aesthetic expression that they prefer to choose. And they're going to use art to represent, to portray themselves, or to portray a particular issue or area of their lives that we are studying with them in the particular study. So through these aesthetic portrayals, they're going to portray themselves and they're going to explain this aesthetic representation. It's not just something that they submit to us, but it's something that they are going to explain. And sometimes it's something they're going to play in front of us. You will see later how this is going.
Okay. So number 4 here is documents and artifacts. And these documents can come in the form of books, or maybe if you are studying an administrator, he or she may share like annual reports. And artifacts can come in the form of objects or pictures. The next slide here, we are going to show to you the framework. By the way, there are several data analysis framework, but in this presentation, we will focus on the framework of Muccio, Reybold, and Kidd. They use two phases, and these are data metamorphosis and data representation. Under data metamorphosis, there is coding of repetitive refrains and resonant metaphors. Let me explain what repetitive refrains are. A repetitive refrain can be a word, a phrase, a sentence, which the participant keeps on repeating. For example, one of Edgar's participants mentioned tree, okay? Tree. And so this tree is a repetitive refrain. Or a participant can repeat the word, I do not belong, okay? So maybe the participant tells the story about his elementary years, and he says, I did not belong. Then in high school, I did not belong. Then in college, I did not belong. This sentence, I did not belong, is a repetitive refrain. And the fact that these statements or words are repeated, that means that these are important or key concepts in the life of the participant. Resonant metaphor, I want to highlight that word metaphor. What is a metaphor? This is our participants may sometimes, actually most of the times, they compare themselves with objects. For example, I take again one of the participants of Edgar who said, I am an espinillo tree, or I am, or I have become a lapacho tree. So as we are storytelling people, we are also people who speak in metaphors. And then the next step in data metamorphosis is getting emergent themes for each participant. The second phase is data representation, which involves the process of writing the discussion of the data around the themes and research questions. So in narrative inquiry, we follow our presentation of findings and discussion based on the research questions. And then the writing of the narrative portraits. And if the researchers decide, they can transform the narrative to poetic portraits. Here, we are going to excuse me, Edgar?
Yes. Yes, I can see that in this PowerPoint, there are not slides representing the software that they use. I want to tell you how to, yes. You know, we were talking about different data sources to work with narrative inquiry. In narrative inquiry, we need to triangulate different sources of data. So because we have long interviews, as we were telling, for example, in a study that I conducted regarding the professional identity of teachers, I had more than 300 pages of transcriptions from my interviews. So the only way to work with this big amount of data is using a software for qualitative analysis. So I work with webQDA, and that helped me to process and code in the data. Especially when we have big amounts of data. So the process of coding in webQDA is really easy because it's simple to use. You can see in webQDA in the right column of your screen how you can code and select the sections of your text that you want to code. Actually, in narrative inquiry, we prefer to use holistic coding. So we select big chunks of data. It's not just words or one sentence, but big portions of data. And we try to code these big portions of data using this software. And there is also a feature of webQDA that I really appreciate. And this is tree coding. There is a in webQDA that there is a feature where you can use a tree to represent your codes, your teams, and the categories inside of these teams. And you can really see on your screen a clear tree of how each one is connected to them. So in this process of data metamorphosis that Dr. Arceli was telling you, you can really make this process of data reduction using webQDA as a software to process the data and to see clearly how the teams emerge, how the categories and sub-teams and categories are connected with each other. Maybe Dr. Rosario is trying to find these slides when we have the screenshots from webQDA.
Yeah, I am, and I am there now. I'm going to show, okay, in a short while. And there, do you see it, Edgar?
Yes.
Okay, I think I should see this slide first so you can explain.
Yes, we have here using webQDA how in this research of teachers' professional identities, how it's easy to create folders if you're working with many participants to organize your data. So if we move forward in the next slides, this is...
You want to see the tree codes?
Yes, the tree codes. Here we have the example that I was telling you. So this is a really nice tool that we have in webQDA. You can construct these tree codes to identify the main themes and what are the components or categories inside of these themes. And when you are able to really create these tree codes, it's easier to make the data reduction and to write the restoring process. So the narrative portraits will be easier to write after this process of tree codes.
Yeah, so Edgar here is underscoring the features of webQDA and how through webQDA he was able to analyze his data. This data that he worked on was taken from his recent study, and here you will see here the main themes and then the categories under each theme, and that's being facilitated by the software webQDA. And so we will continue in the next slides. I'm quite very excited about this one, you know. We are going to show to you samples of aesthetic portrayals, narrative portraits, and poetic portraits. I think this is one of the questions that you want to ask, like, so how does an aesthetic portrayal look like? Or how does a narrative portrait look like? Or how does a poetic portrait look like? So here in this slide, you see this is one aesthetic portrayal made by one of our participants. I conducted a study with my colleague, Evelyn Obo, which we published in 2017. The title of the article was The Portrait of a Superwoman. Our participant, you can see there, drew this picture. You will see flowers, but actually that is showing the face of a woman. And to explain what she meant by that drawing, she composed a poem, okay? Now the next slide was made by the participant of Edgar.
Yes, this is an aesthetic portrayal. We were talking about aesthetic portrayals and how to use it as a data source for our narrative inquiry. So this is a good example. This participant in my study, she made some chocolates and she filled that chocolate with different flavors. So she brought to me these chocolates. She opened the box. The smell was really, really yummy. And then she said to me, Edgar, please take one of the chocolates and eat one of them. So when I ate the chocolate, she said, now you have something from me in you. Oh, this is really strong. This is what I want for my students. I want them to take something from me, something that they will take for the rest of their lives. So this is a way to represent themselves as a teacher, herself as a teacher, using an aesthetic representation and playing somehow an action in front of me in order to explain herself, to portray herself. So I used this idea of take something for me and take that with you in her narrative, in her personal story.
Okay, the next one is, you will see again from Edgar's work.
This is an example of a aesthetic portrayal using a metaphor. In this case, the participant is not creating art, it's just taking some objects to represent himself using a metaphor. In the left side, you will see an espinillo tree. And you can see it's a really disgusting tree full of thorns that is really harming the people around. And nobody's taking care about this tree because it is something that people really don't like. In the right side, you will see a lapacho tree, which is really a wonderful, a big, a tall tree full of flowers. So this participant represents himself using this metaphor. I was an espinillo tree. But along my way, during 25 years of teaching experience, I now feel I am a lapacho tree. I get converted into a lapacho. See, this is a metaphor of a metamorphosis, of a life change during 25 years of teaching experience.
So in the 3 slides, if you recall, maybe I can show again. Here, this is a drawing with a poem. And then this one is something that is really handmade, you know, it's food. And I consider that quite really a unique art representation. And this one, these are photos. These are only 3 examples, but the creativity of our participants will surprise us. Always
Yes.
I'm asked, like, some researchers ask me, like, what if my participants are not as artistic as your participants? But I say, trust that your participants are able to represent themselves in aesthetic forms. The next 2 slides here are examples of narrative portraits. One question that we may ask is, how do I present the narrative portrait? Shall I do a first-person account, or shall I do a third-person account? So we give here 2 examples. This example on the slide now is a first-person account. This was a study conducted by Henderson in 2005, and the title of the article is Staying Power, the Experience of ESL Students at an Urban Community. Okay, so this is the narrative. My reading class was the most difficult for me. I could not understand the professor. I didn't have anybody to help me at home. So I was used to struggling by myself. I always try to do everything well. I think I know how to study well and get top grades. It's very important. It gives me confidence to go ahead. Sometimes I read it, but I don't understand it. So I have to read it again and again until I can get the idea. So I catch up and I get a good grade. Here, the researcher actually wrote 2 narratives. One, the third person, and the other, the first person. Then the researcher showed these 2 versions to the participant. First, the researcher read the third person, and the participant said, "Oh, you did a good job." But when the researcher read the first person account to the participant was moved to tears. Okay? So the researcher decided to use the first person account. In the next slide, we got this from the study of Edgar. Again, the title is Professional Identities of Teachers. I would like to ask Edgar to explain to us, because what we are going to show to you is the opening paragraph, and then in the next slide, we will show to you the closing paragraph, how he conceptualized what to write in the opening paragraph and what to write in the closing paragraph of this narrative portrait.
Yes, this narrative portrait is written in third person, and it's important to choose when to use first person account in the narrative portrait or third person. It depends, in our opinion, to the story. Each story is different, and this story should be co-constructed with the people who are our participants. So it's good to ask to them. Of course, we are working with a member check-in. So we write the narrative portrait and we ask them, is this representing your life? Can I do it in a different way? So that will help us to understand, should I write in a first person narrative or in a third person? So this is a decision regarding that is connected to the story. Each story is different, and to the discussion or analysis with the participants that we have. So in this case, if you remember the Espinillo tree and the Lapacho tree, this is the beginning paragraph of my narrative portrait. This narrative portrait took me 16 pages. So it's 16 pages of one participant portraying his life, the professional life of this participant. So in the beginning, in the opening paragraph, And in the closing paragraph, I am using the same metaphor that the participant brought to me as a narrative, as an aesthetic portrayal. And he used this idea of the Espinilio tree and the Lapacho tree. So you can see here how I am describing his metaphor, actually describing the physical environment in which the participant was living in, and also I am describing the participant himself. So we can use these aesthetic representations to describe the people during or along our narrative portraits. So at the beginning, the participant was feeling like, I am an Espinilio tree. I am full of thorns. I can harm my students with my words. I am a hard person with my students. If we see in the next slide, the closing paragraph, now the participant is describing himself as a Lapacho tree. So I am writing the narrative portrait, expressing how this metamorphosis in the life of the participant took place, and how the participant now is feeling like something really higher, hard as a rock, really wonderful in the middle of the jungle. So he is a different person. And this metamorphosis is represented using the same aesthetic portrayals that the participants are using to represent themselves.
But I think I should read this one, Edgar, because they say
Yes.
stories are meant to be heard. And I would just want to celebrate with you how well Edgar, wove the story. And I want you also to note that Edgar here is using the first, the present, or the historic present. Okay, so it says, the land is flat in that central region of Argentina, so flat that it never ends. Instead, it fuses with the horizon as they meet. Apart from 1,000 hectares of soybean plantations, the only thing that grows there is a small tree. Too small a tree for so big a title. People there call this small tree Espinilio, which means a mass of thorns, because it is dressed with sharp thorns all around its knotted and misshapen branches. The locals know that its wood is of no use, so they just ignore the Espinilio, even though it is the only thing that embellishes the perpetual plains. And then the close of that narrative goes like this. On the pinnacle of the hill, Nahuel stops and leans on his bike. And there before his eyes stands the proud, majestic Lapacho tree in full bloom, standing out above the rest in the jungle. His face radiates joy and satisfaction as tears flow down his cheeks. By God's mercy, the twisted and thorny Espinilio tree that Nahuel once was is transformed into a majestic Lapacho tree, an exotic local tree whose red timber is hard as a rock, whose height exceeds that of all other trees, and whose thousands of pink flowers decorate the jungle in spring. Such metamorphosis has taken more than 25 years through a slow process that Nahuel credits only to God. So this is an example of a narrative portrait in the third person. And
Yes.
I want to highlight here that Edgar took the repetitive refrains and the resonant metaphors in constructing the narrative portrait. The next slide here, we are showing a poetic portrait. This poem captures the life of one participant. This study, I did this study with my colleague, Janina Petri. She's from Romania, and this study was conducted in Romania with Adventist women who stopped. Usually most of them stopped at the 8th grade during a time when there was religious restrictions. And when these religious restrictions were lifted, they were able to go back to school at an adult age. That's why the title of the study is Blooming After the Storm, Transforming Women's Lives Through Education. So we captured the life of one participant and wrote a poetic portrait. Now, I would like to highlight here that in the story of the participant, we noted a repetitive refrain, and that's the word dream, dream. And so we use that repetitive refrain to weave the poetic portrait. Okay, let me read. I woke up with a crippling terror gripping my heart. The dream, the dream, the dream had come again the third time. No, the fourth time. For years, this visitation had come with clarity, with urgency, to inspire me, to torture me. I saw myself in a classroom. Was that a classroom? I was writing on a chalkboard many things I was so sure of that could not be. Many years had passed, years of broken dreams. 10 years of school, that's enough for you. So the years rolled, my dreams lay downtrodden by the passing of time. But the dream would not go away. Every so often it came to haunt me, or perhaps to show me a better way. Many voices joined, and in one chorus said, "Go." So I left home, clutching my school bag. Whose mother are you? I'm nobody's mother. I'm a student. Some years in between, I left school, clutching my diploma. Somebody asks, "Are you the teacher?" I smile. "Yes, sir, I am." Okay? So this is an example of a poetic portrait. The next poetic portrait we're going to show to you, this is the study I did with Evelyn Obo on the superwomen. The poem here actually is a composite portrait. Composite means we took all their experiences and put them together and wrote this poem. All right? Let me read. The superwoman. She is the woman in the classroom, her fingers dancing in the keys, or caressing furrowed brows, or tracing blurred lines. She is the woman in the home, her hands soiled or burned or simply full. She is the woman before the cross, her knees bended and callous, her head bowed. She is the woman whose heart's embers ever glow in the ebbing and the heaving of life. She is the woman who daily basks in the warmth and freshness of love's rays and the strength that flows from vein to vein. She is the woman whose hands are clasped in the strong and firm grasp of life and strength and power, in the presence that is ever near, in the love that is ever real. She is the superwoman. And perhaps you will note that on the right side, there's a charcoal drawing here. My colleague Evelyn Ovo and I did not make this ourselves. We asked somebody to draw this for us, but of course, we gave the concept. Okay, so we have just shown to you samples of aesthetic portrayals, of narrative portraits, and poetic portraits. We are now on the last part, and Edgar will explain to us ethical considerations that are unique or distinct to narrative inquiry.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rosario. We will try to let some time for some questions that I can see are popping up in our chat. So let me choose one of these ethical considerations, maybe the most important one. we are talking about a co-construction of these narratives. So as we engage with people, it's important to really protect the integrity, the emotional integrity, and to avoid harm at any cost. So it's important to uphold their dignity. We can do that keeping confidentiality of our information, because they are going to share really private details of their lives. But also it's important to always give them the credit that the story that they are sharing belongs to them. So it's important, this process of member check. You know, member checking is a process that brings research rigor to our studies. When we finalize our narrative portrait, we need to give this portrait to our participants, and they will judge if this portrait really represents them, if this portrait is honoring them, is providing them dignity and upholding them. So they will be the judges of our narrative portraits. And this is a way to protect their emotional integrity, also to be sure that we're going to represent in our articles something that they want to be there, and to avoid information that they don't want to be present in our reports when we write an article. So these are ethical considerations that we need to take in consideration when we are working with narrative inquiry. Sonia, I know that we have some questions there.
Okay, so this is the end of our presentation, and we are now ready to answer the question.
The language of the participants and the vernacular language, and if maybe recognizing if the software is able to recognize and to work with different languages. For example, my study about the professional identity of teachers, data was taken in Spanish, actually. And I realized that webQDA is able to work with many languages, actually all of them. But the process of coding was made, I did it using English. So yes, we can use the vernacular. Actually, we should use the vernacular language. We should not translate the original narrations. Otherwise, we will lose rich data and rich expressions that we get only in the original language. Of course, we should be also proficient in the original language that we are working with. So because my mother tongue is Spanish, I was able to understand the old expressions in Spanish. So we can use any vernacular language, work in the original language, and the software without problem is going to recognize the language, and we can process the process of coding usually in English, because we are going to publish later in English. So we can do that, and actually we need to work, this is our idea, to work in the original or vernacular language.
There's another,
I don't know if the
Sonia, do you want them to, or do you want us to continue with the questions here, or
yes,
do you want to get the response?
Can we please reply to the questions in the chat window first, and then if we have some time
all right,
at the end,
a follow up. Okay.
Okay.
I think here's a question, Edgar, about. I want to answer this question regarding the points of view, the first person account or the third person account, and if it is possible to mix. It's good that I have here the book edited by Clandinin, titled Handbook of Narrative Inquiry. In one of the chapters, the author Atkinson mentioned that yes, it can be done. You can present in the first person the whole from the beginning to the end. You can present in the third person from beginning to the end, or you can also shift. In fact, I read one article, perhaps I can respond to that one later, I'm trying to recall, but there's an article where the author did a poetic portrait presenting the first person account and then the third person account. Like it's a conversation, like the voice of the participant and then followed by the voice of the researcher. I can share with you that poem. It's very interesting. So my answer to this question is yes, you can do that one. Okay. The next
Yes.
question here, Edgar, is interesting. Some of the expressions by participants or respondents or samples seem to be quite time consuming on their part. Why would they spend that kind of time for someone else's research? This is a very interesting question. That's right, especially when we mentioned that the interviews come in a series of like 3 or even more engagements. So Edgar, kindly answer that question.
Yes, actually, because in narrative inquiry, we are not going to ask questions to get some specific answers, but we are just asking questions in order to trigger narratives. We are going to get really rich data. They are going to tell stories. And some of them, they're going to start the story when they were just children, you know, and they will move forward their entire life. And we need to honor that. Actually, why is this participant choosing childhood to start the story? And this is an important element. So we cannot discard information or say this is important and this is not. I don't want to hear this part of the story. Maybe I'm losing too much time in hearing these stories. But each part of each decision in our participant in sharing this particular piece of story or information actually is important. It's telling us something about this particular life. So yes, it's time consuming. Narrative inquiry takes time. We need to hear people for long hours, but let me tell you, this is rich data that other kind of research designs are not able to gather. So this rich data, even though can be overwhelming for us, actually are providing us a holistic approach to the entire self of our participants. It's a different approach to research, of course.
But I think Edgar, the question here is also focused on like why would participants spend so much time? I think based on our, so it's like actually both, Edgar. We as researchers, are we willing to spend so much time? Our participants, are they willing to spend so much time? I think both of us should speak on our experience. On Edgar's experience, I know his participants willingly engaged with him, spent time with him. In my experience, of course, Edgar did a study in Latin America. Maybe that's cultural for people to be willing to participate and engage themselves. And for my studies, I conducted studies here in Asia. But Janina Petri and I did study also in Romania, which is Europe, and it's the same experience. People, the participants were willing to spend time to share their stories. Okay, so that's our answer. Yeah, there's one question here, like who is going to compose the stories, or so we will have to compose the poems. The answer here is for the poetic portrait, the samples that we showed to you, yes, we, the researchers, composed the poetic portraits just like we researchers will be the ones to compose the narrative portraits. But I would like to say that in the aesthetic portrayals, the participants may compose poems to represent themselves.
Yes, I can see here, Dr. Rosario, one question from Cel. So he's asking if all our inquiry reports or the narrative representation should be organized in chronological order. Well, we explained that we have two ways to portray the narrative. This is narrative portrait or poetic portrait. In narrative portrait, we usually organize in chronological order because it's a narrative and the narrative follows a plot. But if we choose to work with an artistic representation through a poem, yes, this is art. You can use a different time frame. You can go back to the past or start with the past and go to the present and start with the present and go back in the story. Yes, this is art. So it depends of our choose. Is if we are choosing to work with a narrative portrait, usually we organize the data in a chronological order. But if we're going to work with a poetic representation of portraits, this is up to the creator of the poem, because this is art. It's not necessarily following timeline.
I agree. Although I think it's important that we cite here Clandinin. That's Clandinin saying that the restory should be in chronological frame. But Edgar, I would like to point out that yes, while we follow the chronological order in the narrative portrait, just like what you did in your narratives, you used flashback. You remember?
It's true.
You used flashback, yeah, but still, of course, we are following a timeline and we use flashback as a literary device.
It's true.
Sonia, it's already time. What do we do with these questions that we have not addressed?
Arceli, if you want, you can. I suppose we can ask our participants to stay for a few more minutes just to finish answering all the questions in the chat window. But I'm afraid that's all the time we have, because otherwise this session will be too long. So if you want, we can answer all those questions still in the chat window.
Okay. Here's a question here. Do you have any format guide of narrative inquiries to do for high school students? I think this presentation is sort of a guide. We have tried our very best to make it simple and to provide a structure. And maybe you can send us an email either to me or to Edgar, and we will see how we can help, especially those of you who are teaching qualitative research for high school. All right, so we would say just keep in touch. Edgar, maybe you would like to answer this question: how to analyze data derived from observation?
Yes, observation is one of our data sources. Through observation or shadowing, we can take this data source especially to enrich the understanding of the context of our participants. The main data source in narrative inquiry will be the in-depth interviews. So we get the narratives from the interviews. But observation is really important as a data source to understand the context in which the story takes place. And the context, you know, by reading Clandinin, is really wonderful to understand how the elements around the people who are telling the story, these artifacts, the physical environment around the people are telling us part of the story. A story that maybe the people are not telling in words, but by being there, by making these observations, we can really understand this context and get a deeper understanding of the meaning of the story. So the process of analyzing, in my experience, the observation is taking notes. And these field notes are going to be part of my data analysis. So these field notes are my impressions regarding what I saw, what I heard being there. And these field notes are really enriching the process of data analysis later.
There's a question, author of Handbook of Narrative Inquiry. Actually, this is like a compilation of chapters. The editor is Clandinin.
Yes.
You may want to take note: Handbook of Narrative Inquiry, Mapping a Methodology, by Sage, published by Sage, copyright year 2007. All right, so the next question is there a minimum or a maximum number of participants? A minimum number is 1. You can, yes, 1. When it's 1, the advantage is you can really go very deep into the person's life. So we have, I have a student who studied the life of our former president. That's the whole dissertation, you know. So one participant is possible, and maximum, now considering the time spent with each participant, I would say, like, Edgar, maybe 10 hours per or more, 10 to 15 hours. That's only for data gathering per participant. Maybe we would say like 7. Edgar, what do you say? 7?
Yes, it's difficult to set a ceiling to
That's
say
right.
no more than this. But if we go to the literature, we will
Yes.
find that usually researchers, they don't take more than 10 participants. There are studies with more participants, yes, usually with big teams of researchers working all together, but no more than 10 participants. If we really want to understand and to grasp the really meaning of the experience of our participants, I took in my last study 7 participants. Let me tell you, this took me 1.5 months only to understand the life of 7 participants. So if we take more, it's really time consuming. And sometimes when I reach, this is something important, in narrative inquiry, we can talk about narrative saturation. So when I was finishing the 5th story, the 5th participant, I felt already I am getting narrative saturation. So the stories and the patterns are repeating and repeating again. I get the main things here. Even though I had 7 participants, when I reached the 5th one, I realized there is narrative saturation. So we don't need to gather many participants, and actually we can work with 1. There is one comment here, please, Dr. Rosario, if you can move to the last slide, when the literature, the references are there. They're requesting to see a list of references that we use to work with this presentation. And maybe because of the time, we can close here and to keep our discussion in the chat. But yes, there is some people asking for the references. In the last slide, we can present to you some references of the main authors that we took to create this presentation. Clandinin, in my perspective, is clear, easy to read, but she really goes deep in the process of understanding philosophical roots and actually explaining also the process of data analysis. So Kim, 2016, and Clandinin, I recommend these 2 authors.
Okay. So those are all. What happened? I cannot see now the chat. So we have, that's the last question that you want to answer, Edgar?
Yes, in my opinion, due to the time.
Sonia, they are asking if we can share the PowerPoint. Yes, we can do that one.
Okay, perfect. I believe there are a few questions that we weren't able to answer because our time is short now. But what I suggest is, if you don't mind, we can share your email addresses with the list of participants that were here today with us, and if they have further questions, they can.
We will be happy. We will be happy to receive inquiries through our emails.